Thank you so much, Melissa. Thank you to Lisa for helping to make the arrangements, and thank you all for being here. I'm really delighted. On Friday, I was walking around the University of Pennsylvania campus dressed as Benjamin Franklin. So I feel like I've got some bona fides here to talk to you. I'm not really going to talk about the Revolutionary era so much. I hope that doesn't disappoint. I am talking about subjects that first got into my head back in the 1980s. I lived in Virginia, in Richmond, for a year and a half doing research. I came back to Virginia, lived in Williamsburg for 2 years, finishing my first book, doing more research, and I keep coming back. Virginia is a place that takes its history very seriously. And what I'm giving you today, you may not agree with everything I'm saying, but I offer it with the deepest respect and seriousness. What I have found teaching at Penn for nearly 30 years, some very smart young students. My best students are senior auditors. So I'm giving you my best stuff, and with apologies if you find it a little bit too provocative. I'm just doing what I do in the classroom, and I'm giving you what I would give to my students. So I'm going to start with this image, which we'll see again. Just to give you an idea, I'm going to start with an anecdote about a kind of mythic white female figure in the history of Virginia, back when, as nobody really actually knows how to attribute this quote, in the beginning, all America was Virginia. So we're going to start with that. We're going to look at how people in early Virginia even understood what it meant to be male or female, how they actually made sense of it. And there'll be a few surprises in there for you, I think. And then we're going to come back to the very daily kinds of work that women did that actually spun out in a couple different directions. One with political meaning for the colonies that would become the new nation of the United States, and the other about the production of wealth in the early United States. And we can trace both of those pathways to the very daily things that women did. And then we're going to come back to that white female iconic figure at the very end of the talk. So if I do it right, we'll do all of that in about 45 minutes, and then at that point I'd be happy to take questions and comments. Okay, so this image is an engraving by a British artist named William Blake. And there's lots that we could say about this image. The title is Europe Supported by Africa and America. And what I want you to notice is that the artist has chosen to depict these geographic places, really these ideas of places with female figures. And I want you to notice that both the Native American woman, who is on your right, and the African woman on your left, both have gold bands on their arms to symbolize that indeed the women and men of both those groups would have been taken in slavery at various points as part of the support of Europe, figured as a really very, very white woman. I think we'd agree she's like one of the whitest white women you've probably ever seen. And so this is he did this work at the very end of the 18th century. This was part of the way people at the time were imagining empire and imagining the British Empire, but also French, Spanish, Portuguese empires. That part of the way these empires were going to become really lucrative and strong and powerful was through the support, but really the exploitation of Native peoples and of people of African descent. Okay, so we're going to start with this little anecdote about Virginia Dare. How many people know who Virginia Dare is? Okay, well that's what I figured, given that this is an audience of people from Virginia. So Virginia Dare was dubbed by her grandfather, the watercolorist and governor of Roanoke Colony, John White, the first Christian born in North America. Over time, it's really interesting how that became the first white child born in North America. So the other thing I want you to keep track of here is that in addition to strange ways that people understood what sex and gender meant back in this time, they also had changing ideas about blackness and whiteness, about race. So what happened is that John White, the artist and governor, went back to England for supplies. He had left his daughter and her husband and their newborn, Virginia, dubbed Virginia because Roanoke was really part of what people thought of as this new world open to English people, which they named after their virgin queen, Elizabeth I. He came back with supplies and the settlement was empty, no trace of anyone left. And nobody really does know the fate of the folks at Roanoke. There are lots of different ideas. But especially the disappearance of Virginia Dare raised all kinds of speculations and ideas about where she might have ended up and how one might trace the genealogy of that earliest settlement in Roanoke to what came later. And the fact is we don't really know. So what I want to do is starting with this, and these are two, that's not an authentic to the late 16th century image of a native person running away with Virginia Dare. That's part of the imagined fate of Virginia Dare. But then also the way Virginia Dare was used in the 19th century to market wine. Sorry, and I'm just sorry, I have this kind of sense of humor, white wine. And a stamp here, which also commemorated her birth, as by then she'd become the first white child. Okay, so here are the questions. What can the story of Virginia Dare teach us about the history of Virginia, about the history of women? But I'm also interested in a kind of a critical way about something that scholars talk about a lot, which is something called settler colonialism. And I want to really be careful how I use this term and how I explain it and how we think about it today. For people who work in the early Americas, the concept of settler colonialism comes much later. It was the brainchild of an Australian anthropologist who was thinking about the case of Australia and theorizing a concept that many people then picked up on and assumed applied exactly as he theorized it to every place where Europeans had tried to create a colony. And part of what he said was that the whole point of settler colonialism was to exterminate the native, to basically bring Europeans into a place, get rid of, push out of the way, eliminate indigenous people, and by planting their own population, basically take it over for the European empire they represented. And what I find interesting about that concept and problematic is that as a historian, nothing ever happens fully formed. It's always a process, it takes a while. And so part of what I want to do with you today is follow what some of the early Virginian kind of promoters and governors, leaders of the company said about why they thought they needed women and what kinds of women they thought they needed. And we're going to watch that change a little over time. But just to be clear, what is a colonial settler society and what makes it different from any other kind of colonial project? Well, if you set up a fort back in the 17th century, usually it was men, not lots of women. It was not usually families. If you were interested in establishing a religious mission, as Spaniards were. Usually it was male clergy, sometimes female clergy. There were nuns who set up convents up in what we now know as Canada, but they were not family-oriented migrations. If you set up a trading post, usually you didn't send over lots of families. So one of the interesting things about the history of the colonies in North America that becomes the United States is that most of the migrations to what we think of now as the eastern seaboard of the United States were very balanced family migrations because they were often motivated by religion. And so they traveled in groups as families. Not quite true for Virginia. Virginia's kind of a little bit of an outlier here. We'll look at that. So the problem I have with the settler colonial theory, besides the fact that it doesn't satisfy my need to trace history as change over time and process, is that the Australian Patrick Wolfe doesn't actually pay much attention to women. And that was one of the big differences between settler colonialism and these other kinds of colonies: forts, trading posts, religious missions. Settler colonies actually needed women, but we're going to look at why and what difference it made. So I have a few things here for you. That settler colonialism mobilizes the household, the mundane, and the intimate to do imperial work. Okay, what does that mean? It means feeding people, having sex, birthing babies, cleaning, doing all the work that keeps people alive. That's pretty mundane, especially in the 17th century. I would argue that most of the work that classic settler colonial theory would describe as settler colonialism comes much later, when people looked back and described what happened and used white women and children in their presence as kind of a guise of innocence. In other words, it couldn't have been that violent. There were all these white women and children there. And so part of the work that happens with settler colonialism is we tend to romanticize and clean up the violence a little because of the presence of women and children. I'll explain what I mean by the end of the talk. And what I want to do with this is just really think with it, as opposed to accepting it as something that tells us exactly the way things were. Think with it to try to look more closely at what difference women's presence made in places like Virginia. And I have here white women's presence, but we're going to be looking pretty closely at women of African descent as well. Oops, sorry. Okay, and this just gives you a sense of, where in the world is settler colonialism? Well, it's in a lot of different places. This little map here, the white portions are the parts of the world with very low European populations, low percentage of European populations, and the rest of these areas, the darker blue they are, the more the percentage of European populations. And that's certainly part of the remarkable transformation of empire coming out of Europe. It really does transform the world's populations. Okay, so we started with Virginia Dare. Let's talk about Pocahontas. Pocahontas was her nickname. Her real name was Amanut, and she was sometimes called Matoka. Her Christian name became Rebecca. And she's an interesting example for us of a moment in the history of Virginia where it was possible for a Native woman to cross over the line between the indigenous to the colonial settlers. And I'm giving her as an example of the great cost of that. She converted to Christianity. She began to wear the garb of an English woman, as you can see here in this image. She was pretty much given up by her father. Her father basically gave up on her, didn't try to ransom her when she was kidnapped by the English. And she married an Englishman, John Rolfe, who has left us this kind of, the best word I can think of is almost kind of embarrassing, kind of cringy statement about how worried he was about having a relationship with a Native woman, how many scruples he felt as a Christian man to do that. She has a child with him. The child's name is Thomas. She travels to England, and she never manages to come back to Virginia, but her son does, and possibly because she's undergone this huge transformation, possibly because he has no mother to connect him to her people. He very much identifies with the English side of his heritage. So what her life signals to me is that the boundaries between settlers and indigenous are already hardening during the short time of her life, and she dies quite young. She possibly was born in 1597, and she's dead by 1617. Okay, so now we're going to look at what some of these English talking heads had to say about Virginia specifically, because it really was the main colony, the first colony. Francis Bacon. How many here have heard of Francis Bacon before? Okay, very good. I love it. When I ask these kinds of questions to my undergraduates, I get no answer at all. Well, partly because they're on their phones or their laptops, shopping on their laptops while I'm talking. Okay, Francis Bacon, he theorized colonial projects. He pioneered ideas about scientific knowledge as being much more in the control of human beings. He was really pushing back at the idea that nature was a kind of a omnipotent force that determined outcomes for human beings, and really saw human beings as much more, having much more agency, but this was also attached to a notion of exploiting natural resources. Okay, so he's an essayist, a scientist, he's trained in the law, and he also hangs around in royal courts and tries to stay in favor. So here's what he had to say about marriage and the single life. This is in 1597. I will read it because the syntax is always a little bit weird on these old quotes. He that hath wife and children hath given hostages to fortune, for they are impediments to great enterprises, either of virtue or mischief. Unmarried men are best friends, best masters, best servants, but not always best subjects, for they are light to run away, and almost all fugitives are of that condition. Certainly, wife and children are a kind of discipline of humanity. Exactly a warm, fuzzy endorsement of marriage or family. So despite his reasoning that women and children were liabilities to men's productivity, or perhaps because he saw women as a means of disciplining men's mobility, the Virginia Assembly kept an open mind. And so in 1619, they remarked, the Assembly itself formulated this statement, in a new plantation, it is not known whether man or woman be more necessary. Okay, interesting. Not maybe what we'd expect. So what are they thinking? Well, there were a lot of plans at the time to make a huge amount of profit off of mulberry trees and silkworms, and that was seen as the kind of work really well suited to women and children. So when they're thinking about what the kind of golden ticket is for this new settlement still under the Virginia Company, they are thinking about what's going to be our way to kind of produce something that makes a killing on a global market. So they're thinking about mulberry trees and silk, and so women and children might be valuable labor. If they went the Spanish route, mining would have been the ticket, and that would have taken male labor. So they were still hedging their bets there. The treasurer of the Virginia Company, though, had a slightly different view. He thought that the colony, the settlement couldn't actually have any permanence, would have no future unless it had women there. So this is where the settler part comes in. He said the plantation can never flourish till families be planted and the respect of wives and children fix people on the soil. Okay, and put somewhat differently, he puts a plan into action for a fit 100th. Might be sent of women, maids, young and uncorrupt, to make wives to the inhabitants, any by that means to make the men there more settled and less movable, who by defect thereof, as is credibly reported, stay there but to get something and then to return for England, which will breed dissolution and the overthrow of the plantation. Okay, so in this case, it's just interesting to me, again, I'm arguing a little bit about against a kind of one-size-fits-all ahistorical notion of settler colonialism. He's not really saying we need the women because we have to increase the population. He's really talking about managing the male population by getting the women there in place, to be able to keep the men in place so they don't just make a buck and then try to leave. Just a few months before this statement by Sandys, the Virginia Company had captured 100 English children and transported them, not for the reasons of disciplining. They were not seen as a ingredient of social stability, but for their labor. Okay, so this is a different world we're in, and just sort of keep that in mind. Okay. For those of you who know your Virginia history, and I know you all do, 1622, the entire experiment of a settlement under the Virginia Company governance pretty much is brought to a screeching halt with the attack by the Powhatan Indians on all of the settlements up and down the James River and in little inlets around there. The Virginia Company project was in ruins, and Francis Bacon had some other things to say about plantations. He has a hint of a criticism of colonial projects displacing indigenous people. And I'll read it for you and you'll see this. So this again is something that tells us this is not one-size-fits-all settler colonialism. Plantations are amongst ancient, primitive, and heroical works. I like a plantation in a pure soil, that is, where people are not displanted. He was thinking of the Irish too, to the end to plant in others, for else it is rather an extirpation than a plantation. It is a shameful and unblessed thing to take the scum of people and wicked condemned men to be the people with whom you plant. And not only so, but it spoileth the plantation, for they will ever live like rogues and not fall to work, but be lazy and do mischief and spend victuals and be quickly weary and then certify over to their country to the discredit of the plantation. So basically he's criticizing the idea of taking convicts and others who were considered marginal in England and treating them like the offscourings of the English population who could be sent over. When the plantation grows to strength, then it is time to plant with women as well as with men, that the plantation may spread into generations and not be ever pieced from without. Okay, so here we get this little inkling that women might provide a settlement with a future, okay, and a kind of a robustness that will protect it. And he's hinting here at a discontented native population nearby, right? Pierced from without. He's referring to 1622. Okay, so that's a little bit of the discussion going on. Let's just take a detour for a moment and think about what these people think about when they think about women and men. Like, how do they even understand, if I can be a little bit graphic, the plumbing, the basics? How do they even think about the difference between male and female bodies? Their ideas come from the Bible, from creation stories, from medicine and law, from the basic wisdom about how household economies run, about government and political order, about contact and conquest experiences, about slavery, of which I have quite a bit more to say, and about these varied experiences in places like Virginia. So let's look. It's sometimes shocking for us to understand that in the past, women were not the sex that was saying no to sex when it was being demanded. They were doing the demanding. They were understood to be the lusty, bossy, morally weak sex. They were understood to be the ones who could lead a good man into temptation and ruin. Okay? They were the daughters of Eve. And we'll get to this in a minute, but one question that arose was when English people saw what they believed was Native American women giving birth without the same kind of pain and then long confinement, they had a little crisis of theology. How would it be possible for there to be women on the earth who had not been cursed as the daughters of Eve to give birth in pain? Like, did this mean there was more than one creation? Okay, so this was a bit of a crisis for people. So women were understood at the time to be easily tempted by Satan and to be just full of teeming sexual desires. Okay? Now, this is a mature audience. Look at those bottom two pictures there and tell me what you are looking at. It comes out of a Renaissance era anatomy textbook. Hmm?
It's a penis on the right.
No, ovaries and a vagina.
Who said ovaries and a vagina? Okay, you win. Free book for you. Yes, okay, so this is like, get your minds around this. The theory was that women were just an imperfect, not fully cooked version of men. Okay, and so, I don't want to be too graphic here, but as an uncooked version of a man, or an undercooked version, my genitalia simply had not fully emerged. I was like an inside-out man, okay? And that's, so they imagined this kind of symmetry between the sexes, not completely dissimilar anatomy, really, but an imperfect and not fully developed version of male anatomy. Okay, now, that's the men doing the scientific textbooks. Every midwife at the time knew, you know, when a woman's giving birth, it doesn't really matter whether we think of it as an imperfect version of a man or not. Like, there's certain things a woman needs when she's giving birth, okay? Certain kinds of care. So midwives were specialists in women's care. Women were understood to be cold and moist compared to men, and that isn't a contradiction of being lusty. The coldness had to do with a kind of weakness. They were the prototypes for thinking about the body as humoral, that is to say, being a bag of fluids that were very interchangeable and easily transformed. So the way it worked is I would eat some food, my stomach would grind it up and make chyle that was understood to be kind of white, and then my body would cook it and transform it into blood. And then if I were a nursing mother, that blood would be transformed again into breast milk. Okay, so it was a constant fluid economy of transformation. And so women were kind of the prototype of that. Men had their own version of this. Red blood could turn into sperm. So there was a kind of set of theories about how this worked. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a quick example of a story, and some of you may or may not know this story. Has anybody ever heard of Thomasine Hall or Thomas Hall? Thomasine Hall was born by that name in England, and as a teenager, their male genitalia descended. So Thomasine then went by the name Thomas, ran off and joined the army, eventually ended up in Virginia, was living in Warraskyack in 1629, and really flummoxed the residents of this community, to whom T. Hall was known as Thomas when T. Hall began appearing in dresses. This is the truth. You can look it up in the General Court Records of Virginia. The truth is stranger than fiction. The neighbors, partly because of what I just showed you, the neighbors kept subjecting T. Hall to the most humiliating, invasive exams you could imagine. It was part of the role of midwives in a community to do this for women, not for men. Midwives were not supposed to throw a man down on the ground and take his pants off and look at what was inside. They would do that for women because they would have to testify in court about the state of the woman's body, about childbirth, various other things. Nobody could figure out what they were seeing when they subjected T. Hall to these exams. And the judge in the General Court of Virginia finally decided that T. Hall would have the humiliating sentence of basically wearing men's clothes with a woman's cap and a woman's apron over them, which T. Hall never would have chosen. T. Hall kind of liked the freedom to go back and forth, but wouldn't have chosen both together. So this is partly what I mean about this being this fascinating period. I didn't even know when I first started doing research on Virginia that I would encounter someone like T. Hall. It's fascinating because people really think it matters who a person is because they're trying to figure out household and labor, and they're also trying to keep an eye on servants who are hanging around together when the female servant could end up pregnant without marriage. So they're paying attention to all that. Okay, so that's just to give you a sense of what's at stake for people. They really did care about this. Okay, so I think I promised you sort of a sense of how people made gender meaningful by looking at what people did for work. And here's the package of what European women did for work. Spinning, churning, brewing, cooking, birthing, healing, laundering, teaching, all of these things would have been part of women's domestic labors in Europe. What I want to just point out is that although we have this notion of housewife, I guess if I'm really going to be au courant, I have to say trad wife, which I say with great reluctance because that's not really my lingo, but that's a concept from the 20th century that doesn't actually apply in this period because a woman who was doing all this work would sometimes have reason to be outside doing something involving gardening or milking cows or churning or perhaps going to take care of a neighbor or exchanging goods with a neighbor. It wasn't really a kind of a confined setting in the sense of sort of leave it to beaver mother. And there's a reference, I hope you all know what that is. When I say that to my students, they're like, what? Leave it to beaver? Okay, so this is the kind of scope of it. And I've come up with this term as for my second book, body work, that basically part of it is just about maintaining people's bodies, keeping them going so they wake up the next day and they can do the same thing again, right? Feeding them, taking care of them when they're sick, making sure the household environment is kind of healthy, getting rid of bed bugs. In the 17th century, that was a big deal. Laundering was really the biggest deal of all. Okay, so when we keep that in mind, then one of the things we notice is that, this is probably gonna get a little too complicated, but one of the things that happens in Virginia is that nobody's really very respectful of African women's own domestic traditions because they've been brought to Virginia and enslaved to do field work that generally speaking, European women don't do. I say that with a big asterisk because tobacco cultivation requires the use of a hoe. And in all of these scenes around the world, what we see is that when the main agricultural implement is a hoe and not a plow, in fact, you find women in the fields. Plows were understood to be part of the mystery of manhood. It was a skilled undertaking, whereas people who were kind of understood to be disturbing the soil less in how they planted and tended They could be women, they could be children, as well as men. So these are a bunch of different scenes actually from all over the world, different populations of people who are doing that kind of work. But in Virginia, that work eventually gets, I didn't want to go there just now, just gonna go here. That work gets shunted off to enslave women at some cost to their ability to care for their families and to sustain their families with the same kind of domestic labor that everybody in the 17th century needed to kind of stay alive and stay healthy. Okay, now I'll go back here for a second. So part of what happens in Virginia, and I'm sort of zooming forward a little bit, is that Virginia's slower than most of the other colonies to have enough English women having babies to reproduce that population of English settlers. It doesn't really begin to happen until the late 17th century in Virginia. But if we zoom ahead to the 18th century and to Benjamin Franklin, my alter ego from last week, his argument, I just want you to see that seemingly private work of getting married, having kids, keeping that household alive, has a real political and imperial punch to it in the 18th century. Franklin is arguing here in 1751, hey, you English people, look at our population growth over here. Pretty soon, there's going to be more English people on our side of the Atlantic. You're the mother country, England, but look at us. Our population is growing by leaps and bounds. And he actually had it pretty accurate that the European or white population, and white is a little bit of an anachronism here, is doubling every 25 years. Okay, that's enormous. It's a way bigger population growth. Franklin was not that interested in the biggest population category there for 1750, Native Americans, which for the continent of North America was still at 1.5 million. Okay, so I'm gonna skip through this a little bit, but I just want you to pay attention here. These are some of the watercolors from John White, and I just want you to think about what it would have been like to be a Native American person who thought about the care of the body, especially about clean, clear, hairless skin as the epitome of beauty, to see that guy there on the end with the big hairy beard. This was one of the things Native Americans thought about as kind of an abomination, because these guys from England would get like food caught in their beards and they looked kind of scruffy and it didn't look beautiful to them. I mean, they had some other grievances too, like having their land, poached and taken away, but they didn't look at English men in particular as godlike. And these are, as I said, John White's images. I'll just point out two things. One is that woman to your right does almost look to be trying to cover herself in the presence of an English guy who's, drawing a picture of her. And then that little girl down there, who probably at the time, about the same age Pocahontas might have been when she met English people, she's holding a doll. So somebody brought her an English doll and that ended up in that picture. You all see it down there? Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Okay, I'm actually gonna skip over a little bit of this here to get to some of the main event. So one of the things that Virginia is unique for is that it is the first place to put into positive law, statute law, a rule about who is born as a slave. And there's so much to say about this, but what I'll generally say is what this does is it creates a mechanism for perpetuating slavery through the body of a woman to take the place of capturing Africans in West Africa and taking them across the ocean. So there's a couple different ways people are made into slaves. One is through capture, another through sale. And what happens with this law so very early, it's the first place that I know of and most other of my fellow scholars know of, that actually puts it into law. People were already assuming it. If a baby was born on the Middle Passage to an African woman, nobody said, is this child free or enslaved? They had already commodified the mother, turned her into a product. And so the baby was assumed to be that, but this puts it into law. Okay, and there's one upshot here that I just want to make sure you are aware of. And that is that nobody cares who the father is if the mother is the person who passes slavery on. Nobody cares if the father is a white enslaver. Now, it's too complicated to fully get into it. Maybe in Q&A we can talk about it. But basically, there was having children out of wedlock was frowned upon for moral reasons, but also because of support reasons. Who's going to raise the child? Who's going to pay for it? In slavery, the mother's labor in perpetuity and the child's own labor pay for the child's upbringing. There's no need for the father to provide support. Nobody cares who the father is, whereas in every other case about white servant woman having a child, everybody wants to know who the father is, okay? And let's see, it also just is hugely disruptive of family and hugely disruptive of kinship, because that child is carrying a property value to an enslaver. And so even if that child's mother has a family value for that child as her connection, that isn't going to win out in the end. The child as property is what's going to be the dominant value for that grouping. And so that child, usually babies weren't sold from mothers very early because who was going to take care of them? It was very pragmatic, it wasn't sentimental. Okay. And what I want you to see, if you think back to the Benjamin Franklin quote about population, whereas white women's reproduction and care of white families was going to enable a political and imperial argument about the North American colonies, what Black women's reproduction is doing in slavery is creating a claim about wealth. Okay, and so the far map there on the right is showing the Black population about on the eve of the Civil War, I think it is. It's 1850, 1860. But what I want you to notice, and it's an important date, in 1808, the United States decides to follow Britain in prohibiting the transatlantic trade. And what that means is that the reproduction of slavery in the United States after 1808 is all on women's bodies. Okay, all new slaves after 1808 come out of a woman's body. They're not captured. Okay? Those are really different reproductive fates. Okay, so I'm going to finish up here. I know I'm running just a couple minutes over. My last few slides here take us back to Virginia Dare. And what I'm interested in is this novel from 1908 by a woman named Mary Virginia Wall, the daughter of Virginia Dare. Anyone ever read this novel? Okay. Good. Sorry, I'm supposed to be a bit more objective, I usually am. You'll see why I have a criticism of it as a historian, and you'll understand why. Okay, so these are just the full images of the Virginia Dare product branding for wine in Virginia. You can see these two here, but she's depicted as very in keeping with how white women were depicted in this period of the late 19th century, early 20th century. But I want to kind of just dig in a little deeper here about Mary Virginia Wall. She has a dedication page to this novel. And this has everything to do with genealogy and reproduction and lineage and whiteness and blackness. to my mother, Virginia, and my grandmother, England. Okay, that's an interesting maternal lineage, given what we've just been talking about. So I wanted to know a little bit more about her. Like, who was she? She was born in Petersburg, Virginia. And her family had deep roots in Petersburg as shopkeepers and grocers until they relocated to Baltimore, where her father was listed as a salesman and she, Mary Virginia, was listed as a school teacher. And I found her later in the Johns Hopkins Summer Directory listed as a student. But in 1910, 2 years after publishing this book, Daughter of Virginia Dare, she's listed in the census as an authoress. Okay, she never wrote another book to my knowledge. So I don't know if that meant she spent the rest of her life teaching an honorable profession. Okay, so I want to this is my second to last slide, so hang in there. I just want to be personal for a second here. I loved the Little House on the Prairie books. Like, I loved them. I went out in the field behind the house I grew up in Lexington, Massachusetts, which had its own claim to being very historical. And I would grab berries and crush them up and try to dye cloth and do all the things that seemed like pioneer things. And I didn't really understand until much later that these books followed a heroic and kind of innocent settler colonialism, because the figures on the side, the villains, were often Native Americans, and they were being pushed out of every new place that Pa Ingalls went to as almost by an invisible hand. So I now look back at this actually as part of the work that's done after the fact of settler colonialism to make it innocent, right? To make it suitable for a children's book series. But here's my final slide and my final question to you. Who's the daughter of Virginia Dare? Take a guess. According to Mary Elizabeth Wall, it's Pocahontas. That Virginia Dare got rescued from Roanoke when everybody else disappeared and ended up marrying Powhatan and having a child by him. So there's one little problem. There's two little problems. There's no evidence. But the second problem is that Virginia Dare would have needed to bear Pocahontas, give birth to her at age 10. And here's what distresses me as a historian. This book is still around. This is from the Good Press Review. Mary Virginia Wall's The Daughter of Virginia Dare is a captivating historical novel. Well, I'll just say it's not really that captivating. That delves into the mystery surrounding the lost colony of Roanoke. There is still mystery. Through vivid storytelling and meticulous research. No, I'm sorry. It's not meticulous research. Now, it isn't without interest to me and to all of us. It's a story that does some political work for us because it helps us suture the rupture between the dispossession of Native people and white settlers. If Pocahontas really is the daughter of Virginia Dare, then there's no family feud. Okay? So I'm interested in every story every American tells about themselves and about this country, but I want very much to encourage my students and anyone who will give me the time of day when I'm dressed as Benjamin Franklin, to think hard about what are the stakes in this story. You know, there's a couple things. You want to think, is there any evidence for this? Is there any historical truth behind it? But then history is also interpretation. What work is the interpretation doing? And that applies to any historian, wherever you identify their politics. Any historian has an interpretation that's doing some political work, okay? That's all I have for you today, but I thank you for your attention.